Hi, I'm C-Tom, and in this video, I want to tell you about the game that bridged the gap between D&D and Cyberpunk for me, Starfinder. So I had been running D&D for a couple of years, and I really wanted to branch out into a different system. I was having trouble, however, finding anyone to play a different system with me, and I also didn't know where to start on all the different systems that were out there, as my only experience was Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. I had the 4th edition books, but I had never actually gotten anyone to play with them, and that will probably continue to be true forever. So when Starfinder was announced, I was intrigued. I had heard of Pathfinder, I even knew some people who had played it previously. I knew that it was a game with a lot more crunch and a lot more comprehensive rule set than 5th edition. I knew that it heralded from the 3.5 system when 4th edition came out and people weren't happy with that, as I already mentioned. But Starfinder looked to be something more up my alley, being a sci-fi game, and I hadn't gotten a chance to play a sci-fi game yet. And I was like, okay, I know Pathfinder is based on D&D. I know I can probably convince some people that I know to try it out at least. And then I find out that the PDF is pretty cheap online. And then I promptly forgot all about it until it came up in a Humble Bundle. Paizo had a Humble Bundle with all kinds of Pathfinder 1st edition books, as well as some of the Starfinder books. Now, I went ahead and got the whole bundle. I haven't gotten to use any of the Pathfinder stuff yet, but now I had a Starfinder PDF I could use with my friends, and we could start playing. So I put out the call, and everyone kind of just wanted to keep playing. So I was a little disappointed, but I had a couple of friends reach out on Facebook and say, hey, we live far away, but if you'd be willing to run a game over Discord, we'd love to try out Starfinder. We're really excited about the system too, and we don't have anyone to play with. Great, we're in. So I brewed up a campaign and I ran it. And we played for about a year before I said, hey guys, I've been running a couple of games, and it'd be nice if I could be a player for a while. Do one of you guys want to try to DM? To which one of my friends was like, yeah, I'd love to DM. Great. Hey, do you mind if we play Cyberpunk instead of Starfinder? I hadn't heard of Cyberpunk. I took a couple looks at the book for 2020 at that time, and I was sold. That's why I'm playing Cyberpunk Red right now. But I want to talk a little bit about Starfinder, because I think it's a really great game that goes under a lot of people's radars and is maybe a little underappreciated. So what is Starfinder? It's a D20 based game, loosely based on D&D 3.5 or the OGL D20 SRD stuff, I suppose. And it's a big book. It's a little bigger than the new Cyberpunk Red book, which unfortunately I don't have the hardback yet to compare. I've only got the PDF. This clocks in over 500 pages, but unlike the Cyberpunk book, which is a big book full of fluff and ads and enemies and example stories, this is mostly rules. It's 500 pages, and about 400 of them are dedicated to the rules of playing the game. It's crunchy, to say the least, but all that crunch comes with a lot of good. As either a player or a GM, this game is full of options for customization or anything you need to tell whatever story you want to tell. As a player, you have access to, at this point, over 83 different species you can play. And that's not just, oh, I want to be humanoid X. Yeah, you've got humans and four-armed humans and robot humans and elves and space orcs and even space dwarves. All those different humanoids are there, but you also have things like a giant floating brain that can hold guns with telepathy, or a 10-foot tall dragonkin, not dragonborn. Like you're like you look like not Ripley. That's the character from Alien. Ridley from Metroid, like the Super Smash version of Ridley. Like you can do that, only holding a big ass rifle and wearing power armor. There's at least 10 different kinds of bug people, from like the Fly Man to the Mothman to the living colony of fungus that creates a symbiotic relationship with any beast that you choose that isn't already a playable sentient species to awaken and augment its brain so that it becomes self-aware, and now you're a fungus covered giant bat man, because that's a thing that you can do. Or you can just play as the weird gray bulb-headed humanoid alien if that's what you're into. And while all those options just for species can feel kind of zany and maybe like the world building would just be wacky and make no sense, because you're in space, because you have all these different planets and different solar systems, it really all just slots in nicely and allows you to create this very big and diverse world with lots of different cultures that lets you tell all these different stories, either as a player or as a DM. And that's just the species options. When we start getting into the classes, there's different ways to customize your class. There's different feats that you can take to further customize your character. It's wild. But all of that customization also means there's a lot of rules. And good God, does this game have a lot of rules. We've got rules for starships, rules for computers, rules for buying, rules for selling, rules for crafting, rules for driving, rules for poisons and sicknesses, rules for weather, rules for gravity, rules for specifically attacking an item to break it. Like, I want to attack his gun, not him, and try to break his gun. Okay, well, the gun has its own armor class and it has its own special structural points. There's 2 different kinds of armor class in this game that different damage types attack different armor class. There's so many rules, and that's just touching the surface. But it's okay, because when you go to play the game, you find that most of the rules really stay out of the way, and you only need all of these various systems when they matter. And in fact, most of the rules that I mentioned are not in the section for players. A lot of those rules, such as the rules for diseases and sickness, are hidden away in the Game Master section. And what I found when I was running the game is that meant that I could make up things when I wanted to. If there was a driving scene and I didn't care how it was resolved, I wanted this die roll to have this action happen and it be very cinematic and cool, I could just do that. The players didn't care. They didn't memorize the rules for driving. They hadn't even read the rules for driving. But then I had a player get radiation sickness, and rather than needing to homebrew my own way for what that meant, I just went and used the rules for sickness and had them follow it. It was pretty freeing for me as the DM to have this pile of rules in my pocket for when situations arose that I didn't know how to deal with. That said, there are so many rules here that almost inevitably, not all of them are great. I don't think I ever used the computer rules as written a single time. Most of our computer scenes were a very cinematic hacking moment. Like, let's put the computer whiz in front of the computer that has the secret files that we need. Can they break in? Yes or no? You've got 30 seconds before the guard comes back. Roll a computers check. I did try the spaceship rules a couple times. They're deliberately very light. Spaceship combat exists in the game because it feels inevitable that at some point you'll somehow have it. But honestly, it feels like a mini game to me within the game. The rules don't really coincide with any of the other rules in the game, and there's a lot of special case rules to make sure that they can't. It's pretty much impossible to use your normal guns to shoot a spaceship. You really have to use spaceship guns. It's pretty much impossible to use spaceship guns to shoot anything that's not a spaceship, because, well, that would kind of be game breaking. And so they just said no reason to explain it. Let's just put in the rules. Sorry, you can't really use a spaceship for combat outside of space. So what does all this mean? Why should you check out Starfinder? Whether you're coming from 5th edition D&D or coming from a game like Cyberpunk Red or Cyberpunk 2020, what's so cool about Starfinder in particular? And the answer is that it's a very gear based game. Cyberpunk 2020 is certainly also a gear based game, but this is one in which you are constantly upgrading your gear, finding new gear, and adapting your playstyle to the stronger and stronger and stronger pieces of gear that you're finding. A while back, I watched a video by the Complex Games apologist called What is Starfinder Good For? And in preparation for this video, I went back and rewatched it. And while he makes a lot of good points about the system, one of the big takeaways for me from that video is that Starfinder is good for Borderlands the tabletop. If you've played the Borderlands game, that probably already tells you a lot. And if you haven't, it's a looter shooter where you're constantly finding guns with all these different stats and modifiers that are better in different situations, or better against different types of enemies, or support a different kind of play style, or even have a special, unique to that gun ability. Starfinder is great for doing something like this. The gear in the game scales very quickly. So the gear that you have at level 1 is not useful at level 5. It just doesn't hold up to what your enemies will have, or at least are expected to have, and what the game expects you to have. So you're constantly finding new gear, sometimes buying it, but hopefully picking it up off of your enemies. You shoot a guy with a cool gun and you pick up his cool gun, and now it's yours. The game is really fun for that specifically. So a couple other highlights from the system are the customization, as I've mentioned. It has a system for HP that I really like, where it splits your health pool between a stamina pool and hit points. Now, your stamina points function almost identically to temporary hit points in D&D. They act as an overshield where damage is taken from your stamina before it's taken from your hit points. But what's cool is that in Starfinder, a short rest just restores all of your stamina points every time if you spend a resolve point, which is sort of like a hit die, over a bigger resource overall in the game, but similar concept. However, your hit points only come back a little bit at a time, even when you take a long rest. I believe it's based on your level, and you can get a doctor to treat it to get those back faster, etc. But it really is, once you start getting hurt, once stuff gets through your armor and hurts you, you're hurt, and you need to take care of that. Now, there's not necessarily an injury track for that, though injuries do exist in the game and have their own rules, because everything in this game has its own rules. But it still feels a little better than just a straight pool of HP that you can heal or not. It gives the players that kind of heroic sense that a big HP pool does, but just a little bit more verisimilitude. Verisimilitude, that's a hard word. I don't know why I chose it right here, but I did, and I'm rolling with it. Whatever. I like the stamina versus HP combinations. It has these two different armor classes, kinetic and energy armor class. This is as much of a positive as a negative for me. It adds some interesting depth to character building or gear choices, where maybe an energy weapon does less damage. Typically, energy weapons do damage in the system, but energy ACs tend to be lower than kinetic ACs. So sure, your laser rifle does less damage, but maybe you hit more often. It's complex. It adds a lot of extra bookkeeping and a lot of extra thinking during combat, which I think is a negative, but it adds some thinking during character optimization, which I think is a positive. And my favorite part of the system is really kind of more the setting, but the system enables the setting. And my favorite part as a game master was the setting. Having lots of habitable planets in a game system that has relatively high availability on interstellar travel allows you to create this kind of theme park style story, in that every time the players go to a new planet, it can have completely different architecture, a completely different culture, a different aesthetic, different creatures, different dangers, different language. Everything can change from place to place to place, and it doesn't feel too contrived or drastic as it might in a fantasy setting where, okay, we only traveled a little bit. Why are suddenly it's all dwarves and no one's ever heard of bread? How does this even make sense? How do these people live this way? But when there's only one starport on a massive planet, yeah, you can have a very like survivalist jungle culture that, yeah, they know about space travel, they do space travel sometimes, they have a spaceport, but a lot of them just live in the jungle. What does that mean? What does that look like? What is interacting with those people? How do they incorporate the technology? You can tell this story. And then at the very next planet, you're at the Drow planet, which is this massive cyberpunk megacorp place where all the weapons dealers operate out of, and there's all kinds of shady dealings going on, and everyone has to be tied to a corporation because you can't actually survive on the planet. So your employer provides your health insurance, I mean your oxygen and your food and your lodging, and literally if you mess up at your job and get fired, they might turn off your oxygen and you'll die. The whole game allows for this huge diversity of setting, combining that with the 83 different playable species spread out across 4 now monster manuals that have all kinds of non-playable species that you can add in. You really have so much depth to work with as a game master, which is weird because so much of the community seems to be driven by organized play and running these published adventure paths. And I think this game is a homebrewer's dream. There's so much to work with here. And I would highly recommend homebrewing your own campaign if you plan to DM this game and you feel remotely comfortable trying it, because this has so much to work with, especially compared to the fantasy genre in general, where you sometimes feel tied to maintaining certain tropes because the players expect them to be there. In this, you can really use the source material to subvert expectations, or at least amuse and surprise your players. The last thing I want to highlight as a positive for the system is how weak the spaceship combat is. And if that sounds weird, it's because it is, but the spaceship combat being very weak means that it's there when you need it and you can mostly ignore it. And when you're making a character, you don't really have to care about it at all because it's not what the game is about. However, there are some things that are weak in the system that I feel like are what the game is about, and them being weak sucks. The first of those is that it's a skill-based game coming from D&D 3.5. That makes sense. A lot like 5e or Cyberpunk are as well. But every level you get to advance a number of skills based on some other stats. There's some math involved and it's kind of annoying. But this means that your skills progress by your level in addition to any other bonuses, which means that a player at level 8 or 9 can have a plus 16, plus 17 when they make a skill check. And that's by design. And the DCs move to compensate, but it feels weird in a game with such a gear focus to have so much progression on skills come from leveling up, instead of maybe from finding better tools or cybernetic augments or something like that. I always felt that that was a little weird. And while the numbers got bigger and bigger and bigger, it made figuring out reasonable DCs much harder as a DM, because sure, it would be nice if like a door was always a 15 to hack open, but at some point that just means you can hack every door without rolling, which isn't great for having tension in the game, even if it would add more of that V word, verisimilitude, not a different V word. Whoa, calm down. Oh my god, have I not had audio this whole time? Okay, oh, I have audio. Oh, I almost had a panic attack. I almost had an absolute panic attack. Wow. What was I even talking about? That scared me. And if the skill system suffers from not slotting in well with the gear system, the magic really doesn't. I felt like magic was so underwhelming and uninteresting in this game. I really just wanted to take it out. Now, granted, I did not have a Technomancer in my game, which is a class that kind of mixes magic and technology to do interesting hacky things and stuff like that. So maybe in that scenario, the magic would have felt better. But it really felt like, yeah, you've got some magic, but you need to pick up a gun and use that, which is fine. But I don't think that that is what the game sold the magic class as to the player. And I don't think that they were super happy with that in my game. And honestly, I couldn't blame them. If you notice, both of those systems that I just said feel kind of weird, skills and magic, are holdovers from the game's parentage. They come out of Pathfinder and thus D&D 3.5, and the advancement is kind of ripped from those as well. It just doesn't match the way that the gear system is made. While in Pathfinder, you might get a sword and it's a sword. Swords do a d6 damage. You get a +1 sword, it does a d6 +1 damage. If you get a +5 sword, it does a d6 +5 damage. Your gear progression in Starfinder, you'll start with a 1d4, 1d6 gun. And 8 levels later, you'll have a 66 or 76 gun. It kind of looks more like the wizard progression from 5th edition, where suddenly you're doing tons of damage, but without spell slots. That's just your attack. That's your normal attack, doing all of that damage. And it really makes the magic system feel crazy out of place in combat. Speaking of numbers, I think the game sometimes has too much crunch. Grappling someone involves making a combat maneuver, which attacks AC +8. And there's a whole pile of these combat maneuvers that you need to remember if you want to be a melee fighter at all. You have the 2 different ACs, like I mentioned, that you have to track, which, again, cool, but tedious at times. There's all kinds of modifiers to rolls. Lots of conditions that can give a -2 or a +2, and then on top of that, different modifiers are different types. So you can have a circumstantial bonus or a passive bonus, and you can't have more than one of a given type of bonus. So you might think you have a +4, but actually both of those +2s were circumstance, and you can only have one circumstance. So it was a +2, not a +4, and it's a mess. It's not a mess, it's fine, but it can be a lot to keep track of at times, and at times it just feels like you've got a whole pile of numbers in front of you, and you just roll the dice and you pick the numbers you think are the ones you're supposed to and roll with it. Then my last gripe with the game is that a lot of the content out there on the internet right now seems very focused around either organized play or at least the published adventure paths made for organized play. And I think that in a post 5th edition world, that's not really what people are looking for from their D20 games. 5th edition has created this culture where people play all kinds of campaigns with the rules. Almost all campaigns are homebrewed that you see on YouTube, etc. And you could argue that's because the first couple published adventures they made, people didn't like very much. But that's not really the point, is it? Is it? The point is, people are homebrewing and they're having a lot of fun. And I don't mean homebrewing rules and making terrible, overpowered classes on D&D Wiki. I mean just making their own stories. Like, make your own story for Starfinder. You'll have a lot of fun. So this turned into kind of a mini review of Starfinder. I was maybe a little all over the place. I just wanted to highlight some of the things that I enjoyed about the game and why I think that you should at least look at it and sit down and play a few sessions with some friends, because I think it's better than it looks on the surface, and I really do think it could get more attention. And they're still making new books for it. Alien Archive 4 just came out, which is sort of like the monster manual, but also has playable races for the players and some extra items like, oh, we've introduced this monster. Did you know that you can also get magic armor made from that monster's hide? That's in this book too. The system is good for a cyberpunk style game. The system is good for a big damn hero Firefly kind of game. Anything so long as getting gear to progress is a big part of the mechanics of the story. You don't want too much available to buy and sell, because finding gear on enemies really is kind of the core reward loop of this game for players. And it was really fun for me as a DM because I got to constantly make up cool, new, interesting items. So check it out. It's the system that led me into playing Cyberpunk 2020 and then Cyberpunk Red, and it's a system that I plan to go back to pretty much as soon as I can. I had a lot of fun and I want to try it again, and I think you should try it too. In the meantime, thanks for watching this video. Let me know if you want to see more videos about Starfinder. I've got more videos about Cyberpunk Red coming soon as I get a couple more sessions under my belt. It's just hard to make good videos about a game that you haven't played very much yet, and this system hasn't even been out that long. So I've got more sessions coming up this week, and so I'll have more videos coming up next week. Keep an eye out for that. Thanks for watching. Catch you later.